Ladies and gentlemen, my fellow feathers and arms, welcome back to The Conversations That Quack, episode number 6, your conversational podcast for the thoughts that linger when the lights go up and the credits are long over. I am one of your hosts, Brandan Jones, and joining me downstream on this adventure, the man, the myth, a quack who can ice skate uphill, Mr. Yfran Garcia.
I love what you did there. Hello.
And if you were just joining us well into our post-apocalyptic future or in near real time, welcome. This is a podcast where Yfran and I rock an often candid and honest conversation about the variety of issues facing the Black movie protagonist in our movie of the week and where that ultimately leaves us as a people. If you enjoy what you hear, help us keep it going by supporting us over at patreon.com/Pandora's Quack, where you can gain early ad-free access to podcasts like this one, as well as our other sister podcasts, such as The Theories That Quack, where co-host Wade Slicken and I dive deep into the movie trends, past, present, and future to predict where we believe this storytelling medium we love is headed, as well as The Rabbit Holes That Quack, where co-host Nicole Matthews and I do a weekly deep dive into the issues driving documentaries that mostly have something to say. But of course, if becoming a supporter of our Patreon is not in the cards for you right now, that is more than okay. Feel free to share, rate, and review us on the free podcasting service of your choice, and stick around for more upcoming shenanigans from Pandora's Quack. And so, without further ado, these are the conversations that quack. Tonight's movie of the week is called Blade. Blade is about a half vampire, half mortal man who becomes a protector of the mortal race while slaying evil vampires. That's the greatest synopsis of all time. It is directed by Stephen Norrington, who's responsible for The Last Minute, as well as The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. For those trivia buffs out there, The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen is why Sean Connery quit acting. I will let you guys Google that one, but that movie is why. It is written by David S. Goyer, who's responsible for Dark City, Batman Begins, The Dark Knight, pretty much a big name in genre, mostly genre, sci-fi, darker kind of stuff. Writing and stars, of course, Wesley Snipes, Stephen Dorff, and Chris Christopherson. Currently sitting, as of this recording, on Rotten Tomatoes at a critical rating of 55% to an audience 78%. So listeners, last week, we continued our superhero theme with Blank Man, where the general consensus between Yfran and I was that although it was still funny and entertaining and comically shocking to some degree, now seeing it with adult eyes, both of us thought that there were stronger movies the listeners could probably seek out to get their black superhero fix instead. So this week, to put a pin in our themed trilogy of black superheroes with, might I add, arguably the GOAT of black superhero movies, and I say that as someone who has willingly rewatched tonight's movie several times since it came out, but never felt compelled to rewatch Black Panther, actually, as much as I enjoyed it. So it's time to dive in to the Daywalker himself, Blade. And as has become tradition, listeners, from this point forward, any and all spoilers will be in play. So feel free to hit pause or save this podcast until you've had a chance to check out or revisit Blade, perhaps the very first time. Mr. Garcia, let us begin. How long had it been since you had visited the world beneath the world in Blade?
Over a decade for sure. Definitely a long time. And also, back then when the movie was out, I only watched it 1 or 2 times. So I definitely needed to rewatch it again to have some notes for this chat. But it's to answer your question, it's been quite some time since I've seen it the first time.
Yeah, it's definitely been a minute. Definitely long before anything related to Black Panther was in the mix, and mostly because I didn't particularly like the sequels or there was a sad attempt at a live action TV series. I forgot who starred in it. I think it was on either Cinemax or something like that. This movie is sort of, to me, how some people feel about the Matrix series, where they go, the first one was really good, they kind of should have just stopped, and then like the varying opinions about the Animatrix and the video games and all that sort of ancillary stuff that followed. But this is definitely a situation where I probably would have rather that Hollywood just sort of left this movie alone than sort of give us what we got. But yeah, I think this is one of the first DVDs I think I ever owned. Long since lost that. I have no idea where that is. I think that got lost in college, but definitely been a minute. When you look back on, you know, kind of what your memory was before you rewatched it for the podcast, was it more in the context of like just another fun movie? Was it one of the best kind of movies you kind of remember, kind of cult classic, forgettable? Like, how did you look back on Blade?
I looked back on it through the lens of a black superhero movie before the Black Panther. I mean, we always speak about, week over week, we've been speaking about how Black Panther is always top of mind when you think of a black superhero movie. And I think a lot of people don't realize that, you know, Blade exists.
Yeah.
Right. Or I think some people know it exists. If you're our age, then you know it exists. But some of the youngins who came way after that, you know, everything's all Black Panther to them when they think of black superhero. So it's really nice to go back and look at it and say, oh, well, actually, you know, Wesley Snipes was there back in the day doing Blade, and not only was that a great superhero movie before the Black Panther, he was a badass. Like it was awesome. You know, I think that when I rewatched it again, I realized back then that he was cool, but like when I rewatched it again, like he's such a badass, and not just him. Like Stephen Dorff, I think is also a bad villain. You know, Sanaa Lathan looks fine as hell in that movie again. You know, I always remember her as looking good, but she looks great in that movie too. So I just think that it's an overall pretty badass movie for the black community to watch.
Yeah, it's funny because this movie is so heavily coupled with my theatrical experience. So for those listeners who are in or from the Atlanta area, I remember going to see it at Greenbrier Mall, which at the time, I guess you could claim was, I guess, the hood, quote unquote, or as Chris Rock used to say, the mall the white people used to go to. And it was one of the few theaters that, you know, we would drive all the way down from the suburbs just to sort of get that classic color commentary. And I will never forget how people just lost their ever-loving minds when Blade decapitates Quinn and catches the sunglasses. Like, it was just like people jumped up, they were cheering and just like woofing like it was like, you know, an Arsenio Hall show. It was just like, you know, just madness in the theater throughout that entire thing. So it's like, similarly, I kind of look back on it as just, you know, both that theatrical experience, but then also he was definitely, Wesley Snipes is one of the few, like we talked about this a few shows ago about how there was like sort of like an abundance of black talent on screen that was just sort of like constantly, you know, in and out of movies that we were watching. And now it's kind of, there was like a drought for a little while, and now there's like a younger class that's sort of coming up. But I think one of the movies that I just have like a weird soft spot for, it's like the movie that everyone's like, you know, when Shawshank Redemption is on TV, they just kind of like leave it on and watch it. Demolition Man is that movie for me. Like, for some reason, it's just like, again, that like perfect balance of like action comedy in that era where it was just Stallone being Stallone and Wesley Snipes being, you know, Wesley Snipes and Sandra Bullock. It's just like a perfect combination of silliness that's just like entertaining. And so I think that like people sort of forget that Wesley Snipes was that kind of go-to figure. And so I kind of think of it more in like that context, I think. So
yeah, for sure. I just want to say I agree with that too. I mean, mine's U.S. Marshal for some reason. I forgot to say like which movie Wesley Snipes really does it for us. Like, that's one I always keep on.
Yeah.
But yeah, to your point, I totally agree with that as well. And I think Wesley Snipes as an actor he's always, for me, has been in some good things. There's another one-off one he's been in. I think it was The Art of War.
Yeah.
Which is another action one that I really, really liked back then. So I'm definitely no stranger to Wesley Snipes movies back when he was making them. And I quite enjoy the action components of them.
Yeah. And then, of course, Passenger 57 and the infamous Always Bet on Black. Let's see. I'm sure everyone was saying that for years and years after that. So now, having the opportunity to revisit this as an adult and with more critical eye, what do you think of it as a movie? Now that you have seen Blade in like a post-Marvel, like basically it sounded like you'd seen Blade and then everything with Marvel has happened, everything with DC has happened, nerd culture has flipped, to which it's almost if you haven't seen the Marvel movies, you're weird, as opposed to the imbalance that used to be back then. What was it like watching this now?
It was rad. It was really rad. I love this movie. I thought it was great. I thought Leslie Snipes was a badass. I think obviously there's some like corny parts of it, but I think it just has to do with like CGI back
Yeah.
in the '90s or whatever it was. There's some crazy scenes. I think first of all, like a lot of the scenes happen in the daytime, which is kind of weird for me because they're supposed to be vampires, but it's all like intricately explained
Yeah.
why that happens. There's some one crazy scene. We'll talk about it later. There's a crazy scene that happens in the park with Frost that I'm just like, wait, what? So I think that's a little bit interesting. But the movie itself, I mean, Wesley Snipes, and it's just he's such a badass. Like I don't know, there's like no other adjective to explain him in this movie or his character in this movie, Blade. I love the whole idea of the movie opens up at the club, right? And for me, it really hits home because it's high paced like EDM, right? And I love EDM. You know how much I love EDM, but it's like a specific type of EDM. It's almost like Eurodance, which is a genre of EDM which was around like in the '80s, '90s. It's kind of the EDM that I fell into when I first got started, and it's so high paced and everything is just so frantic, right? So you just see it, and I want to make sure to call out Eurodance as a specific genre because it does seem like these were Eastern Europeans or Russians or whatever these vampire culture was. So it did have that whole European component, and I love how they tied that into the whole Eurodance, like EDM beats, the high beats per minute of the club scene. And then right, it just opens up and it's just madness, right? It's blood everywhere. I love how in the beginning, I didn't catch this before back then when I watched it, but in the beginning, how that guy's a human and they're getting ready to feed on him. I just love the whole scene. I love the whole opening scene. I think Steven Dorff as Frost is such a good villain in my opinion. He scares me. I think he's great. I think he also had some funny lines. But I think overall, Wesley Snipes is just such a badass, and the whole fighting vampires thing, the lines that he gets in the movie, which are really, really funny. One of my favorite is, "Motherfucker, are you out of your mind? Are you out of your damn mind?" Oh my god, what a line! What a line! And I think he has like a lot of lines like that are just so funny. Overall, for me, the movie we'll get into it, but the movie for me is quite good.
Yeah, that club scene is probably unmatched for introducing just a character in any genre because it's just the way they all pull back and it just like reveals him, and the way how there's just they're all sort of scared. Someone screams like someone just is like, oh, it's the Daywalker, with this sort of like mysteriousness, and then like the fact that like wait like that like Blade just sort of like smirks or like smiles as he's walking forward.
It's the smirk for sure.
It's just like it just has, I think the thing that I noticed with this movie, like more so than even in the past, is just like it's all attitude. Like it's just all attitude. And if you had like any other actor, this movie would just break. Like it would probably be like a C plus at best. It would be like a weird monster of the week type of movie, but just Wesley Snipes just looks like he's having so much fun and he's just so comfortable in this like absurd premise of like I'm half vampire and half like just like all these things that like shouldn't work, like down to even some of the dialogue that he says that you're like hearing it now is like, oh, that finally sounds stupid to me, but just like hearing him say it, you're just like, oh, that's cool though. Like he just like says it like so matter of factly. And yeah, just that opening, especially with like the action scenes and all that kind of stuff in the beginning, it's like such a great opening that sort of like sets the tone for everything. And I think that's just one of those things where like it's probably very, very underutilized in movies now. There was even that kind of phase of movies where like they, you'd have your, James Bond type of opening, and then the rest of the movie wouldn't like live up to it. And I think again, like because as cool as like the music is, which is funny because I remember like downloading that in like Napster. I think it just like playing that on like loop over and over. But just like as cool as the music was and just like that whole vibe, like it just kicks off just more and more and more as the movie goes along. And there's probably even just like a lot of things that like it would be interesting to ask a few filmmakers, because this movie's, if I'm not mistaken, is pre-Matrix. And so one of the things that I was skimming, and we'll kind of do some trivia towards the very end, but I was sort of like skimming it through kind of if there's anything kind of worth bringing into the conversation. They were like when that park scene that you referenced, when Frost sort of dodges the bullets, they were like, that was actually the first time that had kind of been seen on screen. And then obviously like the Matrix sort of like made it popular. The like long black leather coat that like Blade has, like, you know, I think it was like next year, the following year again, like was made popular with the Matrix. So to your point about people just not really remembering Blade, I remember Wesley Snipes when Black Panther came out kind of being like, yeah, this is cool, but like, you know, I did this first. And it was like funny because exactly as you said, like the older people were like, oh yeah, like put some respect on like Blade. And then other people were like, what are you talking about? Who are you, old man? Kind of stuff.
Yeah, did you actually say that was a Blade? So Blade came before the Matrix? Is that what you said?
Yeah, I think it actually came out in like
Ah,
'98, if I'm not mistaken, '98 or '97, and then the Matrix came out in '99.
that's interesting because it does seem there are some similarities here. I also didn't know that Blade did that first. I know exactly what you're talking about, the Stephen Dorff
Yeah,
with the in the park scene where he shoots the bullets and he dodges them pretty easily. Obviously, that's a key component of the Matrix, or iconic scene in the Matrix. And then also, yeah, the long black coats also in the Matrix. Really interesting to know. I did not know that. Yeah, that's a really good point. Thanks for bringing that up.
yeah, yeah. I think one of the other things that I thought was interesting, kind of like from the beginning, is you've probably heard or kind of gotten wind of sort of the controversy occasionally. It's almost top of mind now because of the stuff that's going on within the Heights, and people not feeling represented. But there has kind of been like this. I think Zoe Saldana kind of brought it up a few times. A few other sort of black actresses. It's sort of been like an ongoing conversation, and then again, kind of brought back because of Black Panther. There's been in Hollywood this whenever there's been a black male lead, there's kind of been a mild controversy because they're usually paired with either a light-skinned black woman or just a woman with like a different race. So it was interesting. It's pinged on my radar as I was watching this because like Training Day, for instance, Denzel has like Eva Mendes, and like Bad Boys, which, you know, we'll find an excuse to watch the podcast at some point. He like there's sort of that relationship with Will Smith and like Tay Leone. And then I think Black Panther was sort of the first time in a long while where it was, you know, Chadwick Boseman, and I'm totally blanking on her name because it wasn't the girl from The Walking Dead, but just sort of the sort of female lead there, also sort of like dark skinned. And so it was like interesting because I was like, oh, that's kind of like wild, again, 2021 lens, like pinging on my radar. Whereas when I remember watching this as a kid, obviously that's like nowhere near on your mind. You're just like, oh, these are all just characters, even to the extent, to your point earlier about Sanaa Lathan, where it's like, it didn't even register that that's like a interracial relationship with like Blade's mother and Frost. Like all of it just sort of like fits inside of the movie and doesn't call attention to itself. And if you make that like sort of like dynamic now, I feel like people sort of overplay their hand a little bit where they kind of like have to call attention to it, or there has to be like a throwaway line here or a throwaway line there. And like even to take it even further, I just thought it was really cool. Again, kind of thinking about, you know, most women that are kind of in action movies are kind of like used as these sort of action, like damsel in distress sort of situations or love interest. And what this movie does, again, featuring sort of this black, you know, lead, is just having this sort of situation where we don't even have to, you know, she's a doctor, she's a hematologist, she's never really in danger, but nothing when she is in danger, it kind of is like, well, we're in a world of vampires, so that makes sense kind of thing. But just all these types of things that I think are just really, really cool to kind of be paired with that character.
Yeah, I agree. It's not necessarily a love interest here with Blade, right? And I think that he doesn't really have an emotional interest in anything, to be honest, other than just killing these vampires and getting to Deacon Frost. So I totally agree there. And even in the park scene when, you know, he has the girl, Frost has the little girl, and he's like, "Oh, watch out! You know, don't worry, don't come any closer, or else she'll get it." And he's like, I don't really care. You know, what's to do with me." But what's crazy about that scene is that he literally throws the girl.
Yeah.
Like, dying. He literally throws the girl through the glass. I can't believe it. I was like, "Oh my god!" I definitely don't remember that scene because you don't really see that in movies, right? When it's like when the villain has the girl, she either gets away or they just kill her outright,
Yeah.
or whatever it is. But like he literally picked her up and just threw her through the glass, which I thought was a tremendous. I thought that was just, I don't know. I thought it was just quite funny. But yeah, all this is to say that I totally agree with your call out there. It doesn't really seem like it was more of like damsel in distress type of thing, and she also handled her own
Yeah.
quite well, really quickly. I think she transitioned pretty quickly. You know, she was bit early on in the movie. She learns very quickly about this dark world of vampires from Wesley Snipes, and she makes a comment like, "You expect me to believe you?" And he's like, "Well, what do you think that Mr. Crisp was, or that Burn guy was in the hospital, who was Quinn,
Yeah.
who just won't die?" um, but I think that she, if anything, like there wasn't really much understanding on her part. She was like, you know what, like I'm about this life. I've been bit. Now I'm about this life. I'm about to slay some vampires as well. But I agree. It wasn't really much of a like a love interest there, which I really appreciated.
Yeah, we didn't have to do the whole waste 10 or 15 minutes of screen time of her putting herself into like stupid danger because she didn't believe him. You know what I mean? Like most of those movies where it's just like, I don't believe there's aliens. And they like go back to wherever they're not supposed to go. And then an alien attacks them and they're like, oh, I guess there are aliens. And it's like,
Yeah,
did like none of what you just saw. So it's cool also that like they just give her common sense essentially to just be like, yeah, you saw even when she was sitting in the lab these the blood cells, like as her from like her professional opinion, like V shouldn't be doing these things. She watched that guy basically like resurrect and then start attacking people and then bit her, so it's like she should be at least believing some things, and then now to be inside of a however much she remembers from being picked up off the floor and then thrown from one building to the rooftop of a next, I would imagine that may register as like, oh, okay, like it just got real sort of thing.
yeah, and having her shoulder put back into place, pretty quickly after it's dislocated.
Yeah.
So I totally agree.
Yeah, it's a nice symmetry on the dislocation of the shoulders. Yeah, I think one of the things to kind of your point about Frost too, I like how one of my favorite villains of all time is this movie, kind of a throwaway movie, Nicolas Cage, with it's called 8mm, and there's a guy when they sort of get towards the end. It's a spoiler-ish, spoiler light is what I'll say, but like he basically, when he finds the guy he's looking for, this guy has this like speech that has stayed with me kind of like ever since, and it's because the guy just talks about how normal he is, where it's like he gets unmasked and then Nicolas Cage has kind of been chasing this guy and he's like, oh, like he's expecting this monster, and the guy basically is just like, I know what you're looking for, and then he's like, basically paraphrasing, he's like, I had a great childhood, like my father didn't do this to me, my mother didn't do this to me, I never had a bad sexual relationship, and I think he's like married with children sort of inside of the movie too, so it's sort of this like incongruous thing where these monsters can just be, we almost have to like make them monsters in our head in order to kind of make them other, like make them something that we can't become. And I really appreciate how like Frost in this movie is very much just like a normal guy, and it just so happens that his path will result in the death of countless sort of humans and all that kind of stuff, and goes like right through Blade. And I've always appreciated villains like that, where it's not mustache twirling, it's not like I just want to like blow up the world, it's not it's kind of the Thanos thing that sort of happened recently, where it's like, oh, you understand this person's philosophy, you understand their motivations, and you actually understand what they're doing. There are moral quandaries with what you're trying to do, and that's why our hero is trying to stop you. But I thought it was just fascinating that was kind of the sort of path that they were on.
Yeah, yeah, nothing to add there. I totally agree. He seems to be mission focused. I really, again, I don't think I'm saying how much I love this movie, but I really do. I watched it again, and I really did like it for the same reason. I just think that he wasn't really deterred from his mission. Like he knew what he had to do.
Yeah.
I think the main thing that shook him up, even like with the whole mother thing, it was kind of a part of his commitment to the cause. But at the end of it, just finding out what happened with his mother type of thing, he thought his mom was dead. He wanted to go after the person that bit his mother. Ended up being Frost. But even that story wasn't that big as it could have been. I think in some movies would have made that bigger.
Yeah.
He was just like, you know what, I have to go after Frost. It's the reason why he wants to slay vampires, and nothing really deterred him from that mission, which is what I really liked. There wasn't really any distractions. We had the scientist or the doctor come in, the woman, I forgot her name, but she came in, and you thought it was going to be like the same thing you mentioned before. Like, daughter's going to be like, oh God, like she's going to slow him down. It's going to be a damsel in distress, but she actually didn't do that at all. I mean, it could have been like one scene where she slowed him down. but she really caught on quickly to like not get in his way.
Yeah.
And I really, really like that a lot. I think he was just really, really along for this mission, and nothing really could deter him. So I like that a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, I also it's funny too because I feel like you definitely just opened my eyes again with like the matriarchy comment from a couple episodes ago because like even with this it's kind of fascinating because he's in many ways trying to avenge the death of his mother as much as he can remember. There's no mention of who his like father is. There's not really a way that he would have like known who that was. And then it's like you have Whistler, who's sort of his, surrogate father for all sort of intents. And even there's that sort of scene where, Karen, I think is her name, is scientist, and she's like, "Oh, you care for him a lot, don't you?" And he kind of mentions that he has cancer, but then just kind of says the cool line about like, we have an arrangement. He makes the weapons and I use them. And again, it's one of those things where like it's that scene to your point could have been overblown. They could have really kind of made this like dramatic, sort of thing. And I think why it works really well in this movie, especially when he kind of comes back and Whistler, is basically on his deathbed, is just that understated, you've taken this from me sort of thing. And kind of like just the having to sort of confront or deal with that, knowing that he's sort of trying to figuring out what's going on sort of with his mother, his like, surrogate father's now been taken from him. And the only person that he sort of has a lead on is sort of Frost at this point. And then kind of again, to take that even a step further, it's like, is Frost potentially then another version of like a father figure since he's like with his mother, there's kind of like the stepfather, obviously sort of implications, but just sort of this idea that again, could have been overblown or kind of made to be silly or could have just had an exchange that would have like sort of slowed the movie down because again, like Frost is just very like logical. Like he's kind of, he's got his style. And as you said, he's got his kind of comical lines and all these types of things, but this isn't really, he's not a villain, you know what I mean? Like in the sense, like he's just kind of like doing his job. And so I think it's cool that all of this subtext is there. It's all the things driving some of the actions of these characters and why they're doing things or why they're not doing things or why they're saying or not saying things. But it's not something the movie felt obligated to sort of slow down and sort of over explain to an audience in a movie that, most people came to see Wesley Snipes just jacking up some vampires.
Yeah, and even the part that could have been emotional was when he first saw his mother, right, Sanaa Lathan, and it could have been, oh my God, Mom, like,
yeah,
you're still alive, like what is going on here, like, and it wasn't really that much shock. It was like, oh, Mom, you're supposed to be dead, type of thing. And she like explained like how she lived or whatever she is now. She's a vampire. She's owned by Frost now, so she's helping him with his cause, and she's killed, and he's killed, and yada yada yada. And it was just like he makes a decision very early on that it's like, all right, well, I'm gonna have to kill this bitch straight up because like he knows that she has gone down this path as well, and she's on the dark side. She's obviously working against him. That's pretty obvious. You don't have to go through like energy rocket science to see that. So I think like that's the part that could have been super emotional for him if the movie wanted to go that route, but it wasn't. She was just like another number, right? She was like another person standing in the way. So I think that was kind of interesting too. And then, I think the most emotional line you get there is like, I have to free you. I'm freeing you. So he kills her.
Yeah.
Type of thing. So, and then it's just like, well, she's done now. I'm going after Frost again. So it's just like nothing really emotional there. Only the cause that drives him, which is what I really like.
Yeah, it's the as he said to Frost in the park, "You're nothing to me but another dead vampire."
Exactly. And that's how he treated. To be honest, that's how he treated his mother. And
yeah.
He's like, well, nice to hear that you're alive, but again, you're nothing to me but another dead vampire. So
yeah.
Bye.
Yeah, it's interesting because it makes me wonder how they'll handle some of that stuff in the Mahershala Ali version. I just presume it'll be a completely original story, and Mahershala will kind of kill it with what he's doing. But it'll be interesting to see if they try to give him more emotional stakes, because like I said, I think what I really responded to, and it sounds like you responded to, is the fact that like he may be dealing with all this, but he's like internalized it, and I think like that shines through in sort of certain things that the way that he is, because you could argue his relationship with Karen is even like, what would be the point sort of thing. Like it's like I don't really like. It's like there's sort of the cliche of like I don't really have time and all this kind of stuff, but it's almost like he's looking at it from a macro level of just being like, you know, we're trying to stop these vampires, you know, for as long as we are able, as long as, you know, Whistler's alive and as long as I'm alive. Like that's just kind of like how we're going to do this thing. But then from like a personal level, it's almost just like, you know, what am I supposed to do here? Like it's like my mother who was pregnant was sort of bitten by one of these things, and what would be the point of like going to the movies or like grabbing coffee or like doing these things when like these vampires are just out there as deep and into the world as he said, you know, they're cops, they're the politicians, they're just doing all these things, and like there's so much evil going on in the world that people can't see, so just what would be the point kind of thing. And again, like it's a cool sort of subtextual thing that like, you know, we're digging down into because of the nature of sort of like what this podcast is, but like I would be curious to see what that new version would do, or if they would kind of just ignore all of that to begin with. And this is also why I really didn't like the second and third one. Third one just sort of a giant mess. It sort of tried to turn into a comedy, but like the second one, like this movie really kind of ask what would happen if vampires were real. Like we could be living inside of this world and Blade could be living inside of this world and we just never see it. And I like thought that was cool, and I appreciated how there was like, oh, like you could now walk through the streets at night, and if someone's kind of, you know, as he said, just like walking a little weird or smells a little weird, you could kind of like in the back of your mind be like, oh, maybe that's a vampire. And I just liked that illusion sort of aspect of it. But then in the second one, they just go so far into how fantastical it is that it just sort of, it was no longer the same genre to me, and so it just didn't feel as cool as this movie.
Yeah, I mean, I like this one, and I actually don't even want to see the second or third because of that reason.
Yeah.
I think that this was so good, and I just have no faith that the second or third could even be this good,
Yeah.
in my opinion. So I haven't seen it, and based off what you just said, I definitely won't take a look at all.
See, now, what's your just broad speculation on, because we've been talking about this the last, during our superhero block here. So kid, there's the ongoing Black Superman sort of conversation, and sort of a kid, kids growing up, they look at something like Fast Color, they look at something like Blankman, they look at something at Blade. What do you think is maybe holding Hollywood back from just fully investing in sort of more of an original story? Because these are like three very different movies, very different sort of budgets, very different objectives. One's kind of very family driven with Fast Color. Blankman sort of takes place, inside of a impoverished neighborhood, and it's very sort of small neighborhood to neighborhood, sort of block to block crime. And then you have something like Blade, which is much more, call it superhero as opposed to like a hero. And then we kind of have those conversations, that are just ongoing that everyone has about representation. Like, what would you think is the hesitation to sort of do this with original characters? And even though Blade's not original, just to kind of, again, why did it feel like it took so long to get to like a Black Panther versus not, if you will?
That is a phenomenal question, and I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't have the answer. I'm just gonna throw it around to you and see if you have a thought on that. Because to me, the talent's there, and maybe the talent's rising now. Like we're seeing more and more African American actors and actresses come on board, and you always see them, winning the awards now, right? I always see it, with Mahershala Ali, with Moonlight and things like that. And it sounds like these characters and these roles are doing really, really well now in modern times. I think back then, the chances weren't there to be. When I say back then, I mean like Blade times. I think the chances just weren't there as much as they are now for African Americans to rise. And I think that I don't know if it's maybe Black Panther is the movie now to do this to give more opportunity for these actors and these more original storylines. I know Black Panther's not an original one, Blade's not an original one. I think Blankman might have been an original storyline. I don't know, but I think that I think it's a loaded question. I don't know what the answer is, but I do think there's hope that with Black Panther we'll start to see more original storylines. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I almost look at it like one of the things so again, kind of calling back to the In the Heights reference I was talking about earlier, and kind of for listeners who, haven't quite heard or been paying attention to that, the sort of short version is that Lin Manuel, I'm blanking on how to pronounce his last name now, but anyway, basically the creator of Hamilton, and kind of the star of Hamilton, he was under a lot of fire when in the movie In the Heights came out, kind of arbitrarily because it's Twitter outrage. But basically the movie came out, and sort of there were two narratives going on. One, the representation crowd, mob police was going after him because they thought that In the Heights didn't represent enough Afro Latinos, basically just like black, sort of Hispanic kind of contingent. And he actually came out and apologized for it, which I also thought was kind of, I guess, the weird thing to do. And it was one of those things that, there's hyper awareness of them. This is not a conversation that was coming with this movie. Like this, everyone was like, cool, it's a musical and it takes place in New York. And this is just going to be like a fun, like, West Side Story type thing. And that was the narrative, and that's what it should have been. And it kind of just devolved into this like, oh, well, like now we're pulling, we're not including, one or two or three or four more groups of people who would likely be in sort of this production. And then the other piece of it is that it just didn't make any of the money that people thought it was going to make. Like there's just sort of just presumed, with A Quiet Place, I think is the first post-pandemic movie to make over $100 million. And so everyone was kind of like, all right, we're back. Like, everyone's lining up. All these movies are coming out. Box office is back. Everyone's going to be rushing back to the movie theaters. And with that piece of it, some of the analysts and some of the kind of pundits that I follow basically were like, Hollywood kind of got into its own bubble again. Like it was kind of one of those things where everyone was like, oh, well, this is the La La Land. So like, of course it's going to do well, sort of thing. Whereas some people pointed fingers at HBO Max to kind of say, hey, well, people didn't go out because they could watch it at home. And actually someone from HBO Max came out and basically flat out said, they were like, actually, that's not true, because when Godzilla was making ridiculous money, we saw people streaming it also like at ridiculous levels and going to the theaters at ridiculous levels. So it just kind of just came down to an interest thing. I say all that to basically be like, I actually have this like weird feeling that like the era of the IP driven, data driven, movie by committee like might be coming to a close, because those movies have historically cost so much money and they had to make, $500 million, $750 million, $1 billion to sort of like break even, make money, and kind of for everyone to get paid. And so I think, to kind of bring it back full circle, I feel like there might be more opportunities for this. One of the things that like Wade and I would always say when we were kind of be podcasting is like, it's very possible these movies are out there and we just missed them, not because of the theatrical side, but because they're like on Netflix, they're like on Hulu, they're on like all these streaming platforms because someone recognized at a festival or saw a this or that or the other and was like, oh, cool, that's a great movie. Like, let me go and like pick that. Like, there's the movie that I think I saw that you may have even saw, and I'm like blanking now. I think it's called like Dion or something like that. There's like a movie about like separately. There's a separate movie about like these two kids who like invent time travel, and they kind of use it to sort of go back in time and try to like prevent their brother from being involved in a shooting. There's like another one where this like kid, black kid, basically like finds like an alien gun, and then these people from this other dimension or whatever come from. Like, it's like these movies are out there and they have really high budgets and they're like really well done. Nothing that like, clearly to my point of being able to remember the titles of them, but like one of them even had like a cameo by Michael B. Jordan that kind of like walked in at the end in like a very Nick Fury like way to basically be like, oh, hey, like there's more here if we end up making more of these. I feel like they're being made. I feel like the issue is scale. Like, Blade was a Wesley Snipes movie that happened to be Blade. And like, that's kind of what we're getting at earlier about like the 90s, where it was like Arnold Schwarzenegger in, Sylvester Stallone in, Denzel Washington in. And now we're in the era where it's like, here's this movie that is about this awesome worldwide phenomenal book, and then it just happens to star Jennifer Lawrence, or it just happens to star so-and-so. And I feel like we might be seeing the pendulum, or that's possible the pendulum might swing back, because to what we've been talking about on the podcast, there's a lot of great talent. And I feel like if we can just get the right creative team to start like pushing original ideas that sort of star these people, I think they're going to see a lot of success, because I think people do want that kind of like at scale escapism, these big stories, like it's like the Game of Thrones phenomenon, like all these types of things. But like right now, the most prominent filmmakers are choosing to use that power to make more Medea movies. And that's not a dig against Tyler Perry. It's just that he can literally do whatever he wants, but like that's what he's doing. Now imagine if Tyler Perry was someone who was like in love with sci-fi, or if he was someone who was in love with horror, if he was someone who was in love with fantasy, and like how he would have then ushered in this era in the same way that Jordan I was gonna say Jordan Peterson's a completely different guy. Jordan Peele is like making horror and like intelligent horror with like black people and kind of like making it a social commentary sort of driven, how he's like kind of pushing that forward and merging this sort of era where it's like these movies star black people, but it's almost less that they star black people and more about like, hey, like what's the conversation we can have because of these movies. So yeah, it's just one of those where like I almost feel like we're about to turn a page there, but I don't know what the alternative is if we don't. And like kind of like what we've been saying for the last few weeks, like I don't think the answer is a black Superman, because like what something that someone articulated today that I actually think is 100% correct is they basically were like, if people don't like the movie, they're just going to be called racist. They're not going to be able to say, I just don't like it because I just think you guys made a terrible movie. It's going to kind of be like marred in this like weird gray area of like, well, did you not like it because it was black? And like that's kind of why I'm like, that's one reason amongst like 100 that I'm like, just do an awesome original character that is at scale, that people and kids and all these people can like look up to, think is great, the same way that we threw towels around our necks and like wore like our parents' boots and like sat at the top of our stairs and like pretended like it was like, a 10-story high building sort of thing. Like it's like we just need to like feel like someone needs to sort of push that forward, and kind of be the face of that. And I don't know where that's going to come from, but
yeah, I so the black Superman thing, I agree. I don't know if we need it. I think it's nice to have.
yeah,
Because again, like I said before, I think that we want African American children to grow up with a superhero that's relatable to them.
yeah,
They always hear about Superman, it's always a white guy. They always hear about Batman, it's always a white guy. So that's fine. Like I totally agree. Like outside of that aspect, I think we need it for that. But if we don't have it, I don't think it's a need. I really don't think we need to have a black Superman. It's also not original. And you see that, to your point, like what you say about like, oh, if I don't like this movie, I'm a racist type of thing. You already see that with the movies that are remade with all female casts.
yeah,
But those movies really just, maybe I am a sexist, but those movies really just suck.
yeah, they're really bad.
So you have like Ocean's 8 or Ghostbusters, and I don't know. I just think those movies are just quite terrible. Maybe they're not picking the right movie to remake with all female cast. So that is what it is. But whatever, that's neither here nor there. It's sad that it comes to, but true. It's sad but true that it comes down to money, or how these films do. You made so many good points. I'm going to try to tackle them individually because I agree with most of them. The first thing is like with the money point. Obviously, like there's not a lot of money being made from these movies right now, or the formula for these movies hasn't been proven yet. So I totally agree with you there. But it's sad that it comes down to money because there have been quite a few flops with all white casts, right? So it doesn't really matter. Like I know somebody just needs to take the risk and get out there and hopefully hit or miss. I know it's not the business model to hit or miss, but there are white cast movies that don't do well, superhero movies that don't do well either. And if you don't believe me, everybody, you guys can Google some because there's quite a few articles on that on the ones that bombed.
Yeah.
Another point you made is about the cast. This is for me one of the most important things. I think they really need. Like you're not going to see a superhero movie with Denzel Washington. Yeah. You're not going to see one with whoever Wesley Snipes, for instance. I mean, we saw one with Blade, but we're not going to see another one today, I don't think. So I think, like to your point, we don't have the right cast. We don't have the superstar African American actor who's taking a superhero movie. It's not a Denzel Washington. He's not doing that. That's just not his type of movie. Maybe Idris Elba could get in there somehow. I know that he was voted sexiest man alive a couple of years ago, and maybe that'll appeal to more people on a global scale because you mentioned scale before. So maybe if we can get him in one of these superhero movies for an African American original superhero movie, I think it could work. But I agree with you. I just think that while we have this new and emerging talent, that's what they are. They're
Yeah.
new and emerging, and they don't have the global scale, in my opinion, to make these movies global, that are profitable. So yeah, you nailed all those things. I think they're all great points, and most of them I agree with.
It's even to the extent of I don't know how much you were following what John Boyega was saying last year about like Star Wars, but like even he, when you look at Star Wars Episode 7, and there's just so much that you can do with his character from the standpoint of you are a former, basically, you were a child soldier. And what does that look like in like a Star Wars movie? And like how many conversations can you have with that? And like where can you go with that? And like you, again, like you're Disney, so you have the ability to like, do we make his own spin-off movie? Do we like just all these things? And then when you look at the trilogy, kind of, and this is what Boyega kind of pointed out, like he kind of just became the guy who screams Rey and then ran after her. And it's like one of those things where it's frustrating because you see once again that like that was like there's it's sort of the double-edged sword when you hear about when everyone kind of has these like debates about like social justice and kind of social justice warriors and keyboard warriors and all these kind of people and like people just trying to do all this stuff. It's kind of one of those things where it's like, cool, I don't actually care if you make, to your reference your point, like an all-female Ghostbusters, just like don't forget to tell a good story. And I feel like that's what keeps happening with the female side specifically, because like Ocean's 8, not very good, but then Widows, which is essentially similar but kind of its own spin, was cool. Like Steve McQueen, Viola Davis, and a few others. But like, yeah, it's just like I just want like Tenet. I like feel like Tenet. I'm like very very conflicted about because I just feel like that would have been a step in the right direction because that's Christopher Nolan. That's like his, the last movie that he had with like a completely blank check, and that was him just being able to command everything. John David Washington, and then it just releases at sort of like an awkward time because he like forced it into theaters during the pandemic, and so like not a lot of people like saw that movie, and it's not even that like it's not that people don't know who John David Washington is, but I just like wanted that movie to overperform so that exactly what we were talking about before, it's like someone who's on the fence or is sort of stuck in their ways of being like, oh hey, there's this like really cool light sci-fi detective story that like features a black lead that like so and so is really into, but it doesn't really do well. And then like Tenet makes like $1.5 billion, and they're like, all right, like if we can get John David Washington or if we can get so and so, like let's just do it, kind of thing. And like that's like unfortunately how I think it sort of like has to play to a certain degree, and I just feel like we keep getting close. And then we don't get it. And so like now with like Black Panther, I think it was definitely a good moment for everyone to sort of sit up in the industry and kind of go, okay, well, this can happen. But then of course we get hit with sort of the pandemic, and then the kind of structure of movies, and Blade I think got kicked out a little while longer. I think it was originally supposed to shoot this year, and I think now it's not supposed to shoot until next year because they're still working on the script. So it's almost like we're going to kind of like forget and roll it back, very similar to Crazy Rich Asians, where the same arguments were being made about how that movie just did super well, and it did super well globally. And it was a great movie, much like Black Panther was as well. But just getting that scale again just seems to be very, very difficult, despite the failure rate of every type of movie, and just not getting its chance.
Yeah, I agree. I think Blade will do well. The remake,
Yeah,
will do really really well, and I think that's a movie that, again, I think it might go. Black Panther is not. I don't know if it's gonna be on Black Panther levels. I think it's still going to do quite well.
yeah.
It's a movie I'm really looking forward to seeing, and I think a lot of people are. So let's wait for that one. But again, to your point, I think everything you said is spot on. I 100% agree with everything. So good call outs.
Some trivia for you. So one of the things I was talking about before is just, Wesley Snipes, and just like this movie is 100% him. It's all his attitude that just like super sells this. So if you can remember these actors during the 90s, do you think they would have been able to sell it as much? So for Blade, Wesley Snipes, obviously, famously got it. But apparently, they were also looking at 90s Denzel Washington to play Blade and 90s Lawrence Fishburne to play Blade. So like Lawrence Fishburne, this is like Matrix era. Denzel, this is like maybe Man on Fire era. I think is probably the closest movie that I can think of that's like this and kind of that. Do you think those does it like fundamentally change the movie? Do you think does it make it a little bit better? Does it make it a little bit just like weird? Like, what do you think about those two names in particular? If they came in and replaced Wesley Snipes?
Denzel's a no for me.
Yeah,
It's just I cannot see it. Even his movements, if you look at The Equalizer,
yeah,
when he was in those movies, even his like this is really specific now, but even his combat, like his movements with combat, are just not the same that's required of Blade. I can't envision Denzel Washington doing backflips, or whatever it is, even in the 90s. I just think it was never his character.
that's very true.
To do something like that. I just think that, like, if you look at Equalizer, I'm really basing this off Equalizer. You can base it off Training Day as well if you want, but I love the Equalizer with Denzel Washington, and I think it's because of the sophistication of how he takes down an opponent. He's well trained at that. But with Blade, there's more of like a freestyle fighting. There's one point in the scene of Blade in the hallway, in the hotel, wherever they are, in the hallway, where he just like does like a Thai bow type of thing, and he's just like a freestyle, like stretching out type of thing before he kicks somebody's ass. And I just don't get that from Denzel Washington. So Denzel Washington's a big no for me. No, absolutely not. Definitely changes the whole movie for me, and not in a good way. Lawrence Fishburne, maybe only because of that whole like, Morpheus in the Matrix type of thing.
Yeah,
I think it could have worked. He's kind of like a more like brolic. I think like the like body type wise. I think it's just like not as agile as I would have wanted to see. But also as an actor, I just think that Wesley Snipes. Maybe I'm biased because I know Blade as Wesley Snipes. Maybe that's why I'm like having a hard time seeing anybody else. But if I guess to summarize, I would sooner see Lawrence Fishburne, but definitely not Denzel Washington. But overall, I'd like to see neither of them in that role.
yeah. The only movie where I would say Denzel's combat is on point is actually Book of Eli, I would say. But even then, I agree with you. I don't think that he would have been able to sell the combat in a way that just like feels cohesive. Like the way that like Wesley Snipes obviously is a martial artist into his own right. So like everything he does feels like that's something Wesley Snipes would do and feels like therefore it's something that like Blade would do. Whereas I think Denzel is a good enough actor to have done it, but like it's really hard to sort of imagine him at that scale, kind of doing the like flips and all that kind of stuff. Like as soon as he said like I can't imagine Denzel doing a backflip, I was just like, yeah, I guess that does kind of like break the break the immersion. But I would have also said the same thing about Lawrence Fishburne until seeing him as Morpheus, especially like in Reloaded when he's like doing the stuff on like the semi truck and like he's just like doing these like moves and I'm like, yeah, I'm like, man, like he was training, like he was putting in the work. So yeah, it's very interesting, but yeah, I agree. It's kind of hard to see that.
And one thing I want to call out, let's go before we go to the next one. I just want to say, like, it does seem, I don't know, something about Blade, it seems a little bit more authentic in terms of the fighting style.
Yeah.
So it's not like, I don't watch Blade and I'm like, wow, that is so ridiculous. Obviously, there's some ridiculous things where he slices off Quinn's head and then catches the sunglasses. That's kind of like, oh, okay, like whatever. It's kick ass. That's really cool, but realistic, probably not. But in terms of the other fights that he has in the movie, a lot of it seems realistic. It just seems like he's somebody who is well trained in fighting, although it's like a little bit more of like a freestyle fighting or martial arts that I really, really like about this. And that's why it's really hard for me to see. Like when I look at Wesley Snipes, I'm thinking somebody who's agile, who's quick, who's confident. And I just don't get that with the other two actors. And I really, really like Blade because of that. He's just very agile. So for me, like the fighting stance and the style was, dare I say, realistic, even though it was a movie with some bad CGI. But still, I still want to believe that it was a little bit more authentic.
Well, even then, the only things that are fantastical, and again, like this is why, the first one is leaps and bounds better than the second and third one, is like when he jumps from that building to building, and then when he jumps from the top of that tower in the temple down to the floor, but everything else is possible. And then
Right.
stuff like, holding onto the train, that would mess you up, but you could do it. Like, that's not impossible to do, but that would clearly mess you up if you tried to do it as a normal person. And like, it messes him up to a certain degree. So it's like, there's definitely a level of like, it's all based on like real fighting. And even to the extent, which is like a huge, like, pet peeve of mine in the Underworld series, they're like, oh, it's vampires versus werewolves, but then it's just a bunch of people shooting at each other. Whereas like with this, they don't really. The movie is never so thin that like you notice that, because like even towards the end when he's kind of like one by one fighting them, and sometimes they turn into dust and sometimes they don't, but really it's just kind of the like, the stuntmen that are probably all the same 6 guys wearing the hat and the sunglasses and like the black turtleneck, and like it's just that's like standard fare for like any movie. You're not like, oh, this, it doesn't feel cheap and it's not calling attention to itself. But as I said, in Underworld, you're like, why would vampires and werewolves be shooting assault rifles at each other? Like, something about that just seems stupid, and like the movie hasn't created context for that to feel anything other than stupid, kind of thing.
I agree. I mean, I just compare it to The Matrix, and I think The Matrix. I liked The Matrix. I didn't love it. That might be controversial. I liked it. I didn't love it, and some of the fight scenes there were kind of just like, oh boy, So I think like just comparing it to that, I just desire a movie that's similar to Blade in terms of fighting styles.
For Deacon Frost, on the consideration was Jet Li, Mark Wahlberg, and Skeet Ulrich. If you don't know who that is, that was the guy who was I guess you would call him the lead villain in Scream. Basically the Neve Campbell's boyfriend who kept trying to get her to put out.
So who was the first one?
Jet Li.
Sorry, I just can't. He's Asian. I don't know. I can't. Sorry, I'm not laughing because he's Asian. I didn't expect an Asian person to be thrown in as that villain there. It's kind of definitely an interesting dynamic to the movie if it is Jet Li. Oh man, no Jet Li for me. The zingers. I mean, Dorf, he has some lines that I don't think Jet Li could even say, deliver correctly. No. I mean, I think it would have to. I think they would at that point it would definitely change the movie because they'd have to rewrite the lines for it to fit with Jet Li.
Yeah.
So Stephen Dorff actually said some lines that I thought were quite good. I thought Stephen Dorff was a great villain.
Yeah.
Even more so than like Wesley Snipes' role, I thought Stephen Dorff was quite good. With that being said, you said Jet Li. Who was the other? I know Skeet Ulrich. Who was the other one?
Mark Wahlberg.
No, Mark Wahlberg. Come on, are you kidding me? No. Skeet Ulrich, I think could have worked.
Yeah.
I saw a movie with Cuba Gooding Jr. This is like so not even closely. It's a bad movie, so I'm not recommending it. Skeet Ulrich and Cuba Gooding is a movie called Chill Factor. Another like action movie, but very weird because Cuba Gooding Jr. is actually like a weird actor in my opinion.
Yeah. Very strange trajectory.
But very sorry. I don't know why he's even in this talk. But for me, I think Skeet Ulrich could work. I've seen him in a couple things where I think he could have been good in this one as well, especially back then.
Yeah.
I thought Stephen Dorff had the look, had that Euro like Slavic look. That this movie desired or needed. But I also think that Skeet Ulrich could have done that as well. So I'm okay with Skeet Ulrich. I'm definitely not fine with Jet Li. It's a hell no for me. And it definitely not for Mark. What about you? I want to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, similarly, Jet Li changes the movie quite a bit. Because I remember even in Romeo Must Die, I think the famous trivia there was that I think it was either Romeo Must Die or one of the movies that where Jet Li was trying to integrate into like American cinema with like The One with Jason Statham and then a few other things. And I think he even said famously that he was like, he just was really struggling to learn to speak English via acting, because it's a very sort of like different skill to kind of be able to say that, because obviously like if you're like for instance, I actually learned this recently, but like British people are taught a very specific type of English. It's kind of like this English that's like accent neutral, and that's what they're taught. Like you can obviously skew, you know, Southern if the movie requires it, or this or that or the other, but they're just kind of taught this way of like speaking. And so like for him, and even when you hear Jackie Chan now, it still sounds a little bit broken, but in movies, when you obviously get a chance to like really nail it, you can nail it. And by the time Jackie Chan sort of faded a little bit from, you know, American movies, he got like pretty decent at it. But like Jet Li, I think never, to your point, got to the point where in an American movie, I think he would have like successfully nailed like doing like a menacing kind of monologue. And I think it would have sort of changed it a little bit, where you wouldn't really have been able to either have that long of a speech, or just something probably would have just been like weird or different about it. And may have ultimately been better the way that they would have changed this or that or the other. But like I agree, it just kind of, Stephen Dorff, I think, did a really awesome job. And it's funny because even with Stephen Dorff, I remember a friend and I from college were like, oh, Stephen Dorff was so cool. And so we tried to watch like his like next 2 or 3 movies, and they were just getting like progressively worse. And it kind of was like one of those things where like his I think he gave like a famous interview, or just his philosophy in general was like he only does movies that like he really thinks you know, he like just he responds to, essentially. And so when you hear that, you know, we like Blade and all the stuff, that praise that we're putting on like Blade and like his character and all that kind of stuff. But then he kind of just kept doing these like weird movies where you're like, oh, okay, man, like go do you, I guess, sort of thing. Like it's kind of, I feel like he probably could have that B plus status career now, but he just kind of went down like a really, really strange path. Mark Wahlberg changes the movie in the sense of I've never seen Mark Wahlberg play I'm trying to think what the word is, just like not physically intimidating. And like what's cool about Deacon Frost is it's like, yeah, he is just this like skinny dude, and he can do that because he's a vampire. Like, you know what I mean? Like it's like he doesn't have to work out, he doesn't have to have these like, you know, ridiculous ripples and all that kind of stuff. He has the like classic, you know, I'm an actor and I'm on screen with my shirt open, so I have to have abs thing, but it's not like, you know, Henry Cavill as Superman, where you're just like, oh, okay, like that dude has been putting in the time since he found out he was going to be Superman, kind of thing. And like that's generally how like Mark Wahlberg like plays all of his characters, like just this person who like works out and or is like, you know, got his muscles by fighting. And you know, you watch a movie like The Departed, that's just all him acting, and he's awesome. Like he can be a great actor, but like I think it might have also created a situation where he got in the way of the story, if that makes sense. Because like one of the things where I remember, you probably have heard this, like Will Smith apparently was approached first to be Neo in The Matrix. And he, I think he did like a funny video on his like YouTube channel, like when he first started, like a few years ago, where he's like, I just didn't understand what they were doing. And he's like, you have to understand, like nothing had ever been like done like this. And so what they were pitching me sounded insane. So he's like, he passed on it. But I agree with what he said. He goes, if I were in it, he's like, it wouldn't be the movie you guys love, because he's like, he's like, back then I didn't know how to get out of the way of like Will Smith. Like it was like, it would have been a Will Smith movie instead of The Matrix that just happens to star Keanu Reeves and Carrie Ann Moss and like Lawrence Fishburne. So like, I feel like Mark Wahlberg would like break that. Like he's almost, and I don't even know, because it's like the 90s, so it's like a little bit hard to figure out like where exactly he was in his career. But like I feel like he would have been too famous or too distracting. So it's like, oh, here's Wesley Snipes, and then like, you know, if you're 10 years older than we are, Marky Mark, and then if you're our age, like maybe I'm trying to think, like he had done like I think it was like Cape Fear or Fear or something like that, and like a couple other like movies that I think were sort of like cult classics. So it would have felt weird if it was him. And Skeet Ulrich, I think, would have actually like killed it. I think he would have actually done like an extremely good job, because it's like I don't put that on Scream. I actually put that on. There's a show that got canceled on CBS called Jericho, where he was the lead in. It was an awesome show. First season got canceled, and then they tried to condense like everything else that would have happened for the rest of the show in season 2 when it got brought back. But like, I was like, oh, I didn't know that you could act, like kind of thing. Like Scream is just Scream, but like when I watched that show, I was like, oh, okay, like you're actually legit. And so like retroactively, I'm like, he might have actually like killed that. That might have been his like Heath Ledger Joker moment if he would have done that.
That's awesome. Yeah, I agree with Skeet Ulrich. Skeet Ulrich. I just don't agree with anybody else. But yeah, it looks like we're on the same page there.
Anything else with Blade? It was kind of one of those situations where I was kind of laughing with you about a few weeks ago, where I was like, when you have a movie that's either super good or super bad, there's not too much to really kind of touch upon. But I think we kind of got most of the highlights of the content of the movie itself.
No, nothing else to add. Great movie.
Yeah.
I like it a lot, and it's pretty good. Check it out.
So yeah, for the listeners, is this required viewing, recommended viewing, or there are better movies than Blade out there?
So you have to understand. It has to be like, what's the lens that you're coming into this as? Like
Yeah.
I think if you're looking for a first of its kind, black superhero movie, way before the Black Panther came out, then for me this is required. I think that Wesley Snipes was fantastic in this. I think he is such a badass. I think he is so mission driven. I think it's a story with not a lot outside of the plot of just I'm here to kill bad vampires. And I think he's just so badass at it. In my opinion, and if you're coming into this with that lens in mind, then I say it's required. If it's just a movie like, hey, like, should we watch this movie today? It's on TV. Like, what do you think? Should I watch it? For me, it's like recommended viewing.
Yeah.
But that's only if it's just like, if you're coming at this in a neutral standpoint, you have no perspective whatsoever, and you don't really know what you're looking for. To me, it's recommended.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll stand firm on required. I think the 90s, I hope, finally get their respect during the 20s as we come up here. I just think there are a lot of really, really great movies that have stood the test of time because it was like right in this pocket of practical and special effects. And even though the special effects are dated, the only sort of like thing in this movie that I was like, oh, that's dated, not even like, not the vampires ashing, not the like flying around like vampire souls. It was the fighting at the end of the movie, actually, because this was the first time I ever thought it felt slow. Whereas like everything else in the movie, I thought felt still fast. Like that club scene still felt cool, and mostly because, again, like we've been talking about, it just felt realistic. Like it's like, this is what would happen if you were walking through the club and like these people were coming at you, and these, like, it just like that. But like I remember this time around watching where like as soon as he catches the sunglasses and he's like kind of like fighting and the music's kind of pumping, like it's like it didn't hit as hard as it used to. And to me, that's still a testament that like this movie is 22, 23 years, give or take, old, and it's just now showing its age. It's just like a movie like that, I think it's just required viewing. And like, I would, I won't put any qualifiers on it. I just think it's like a cool sort of movie that you can just kind of like pop in and like check out. But I will say, if you actually really do appreciate that era of like, I don't care what this movie is, Arnold Schwarzenegger is in it, or I don't care what this movie is, like Stallone is in it, or Seagal or Van Damme. Like this is definitely like peak that era of Wesley Snipes kind of doing what Wesley Snipes did in the 90s. And then it just so happens that it's a Marvel movie, and just so happens that it's a vampire movie, and just so happens. So required viewing for me. And then I'll give you the honorable mention. We mentioned it before, of the Book of Eli. Since we're closing out the theme here, any putting you on the spot, any movies, since we'll be leaving the superhero genre behind for at least a little while here, that you think you'd recommend to folks now that we've covered Blank Man and Blade and Fast Color and all the things that we've mentioned?
You mentioned the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen earlier.
Yeah.
And I quite like that movie a lot.
Yep.
So I wanted to hear more of what you were going to say about that. I guess I'll Google it because I want to hear why Sean Connery left the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, or left acting after that movie. So I'll look into that as well. But I do like that movie. I do like, we watched Fast Color, and I thought there was a movie with a similar type of feeling called The Darkest Minds. It has a terrible, terrible Rotten Tomatoes score. So just know that if you are going to watch that, you are forewarned. But I would still recommend that as well. I thought that was better than Fast Color that we watched before in the past. So that's it. Nothing like really like not any strong recommendations there. Kind of like probably recommended viewing and not required viewing there at all. But
Yeah.
yeah. What about you? Any recommendations from you outside of the Book of Eli?
Just the one from last week for for listeners just jumping into this episode. I had mentioned because Blank Man is sort of the localized hero that Attack the Block, starring John Boyega. Definitely kind of recommend that. And then we'll probably watch this in a different context. I was almost going to suggest Ghost Dog starring Forrest Whitaker, but I think it's more crime. So we'll probably watch that in like a month or so, but yeah, that's pretty much it. I think for the hero genre. If we come up with some more stuff, we'll come back with a little bit of a skew.
Yeah, for sure. I know, like outside of I don't know if this was superhero, but more like I don't think it's a superhero. But I think you mentioned like Attack the Block was that one last week, but it wasn't a superhero, but kind of just a movie to check out.
Yeah, exactly. And with that, my fellow feathers and arms, that is episode number 6. As we mentioned up top, if you enjoyed what you heard, help us keep it going by supporting us over at patreon.com/Pandora's Quack and becoming a patron of one of our tiers, starting as low as $1, which includes early ad-free access to shows like this and more. Our Patreon is also where you can submit movies for us to get to in the future and perhaps inspire our next block of films. Yfran, it is finally time to laugh. We started off with some heavy stuff, talking about the system. We just finished up superheroes. Next week, listeners, we are going to kick off our comedies featuring a black lead with none other than Sister Mary Clarence in Sister Act.
Oh my goodness, I cannot wait. And just so you know, I've seen this movie over 50 times. It has to be.
It's been a minute.
So I cannot wait for this.
It's been a minute. Other than that, feel free to share, rate, and review us on the free podcasting service of your choice, and stick around for our aforementioned sister shows. Thank you, Yfran. Thank you, listeners. This podcast was produced by Pandora's Quack. He's Yfran Garcia. I'm Brandan Jones, and these are the conversations that quack. Good night.